and we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you to our first Friday forum. This is one of a series of forums that we're doing while the Ethical Society membership and community is not yet able to come together physically. We're trying to come together virtually. As you know, we come together on Sundays for platform, and we're meeting together every first Friday for a member to share some thoughts and expertise with us. And so we're so glad that you're here to be able to hear from Dr. Casey Gardonio-Foat. Before we get into her presentation, let's do a couple of logistical items. First, we're going to ask that you mute yourself while she's talking. As you might imagine, it's very hard as the presenter to be distracted by other people. So thank you in advance for knowing that you'll be muted during the presentation and that you'll get a chance to share your thoughts during the question and answer section at the end. So that's number one. Number two, you are not pressured by us to have yourself on camera. You are, though, welcome to stay on so she can see your smiling face. It is certainly a lot easier on the presenter's end to have smiling faces coming back. So please feel free to continue to show your face on camera. And then know that we come together every first Friday. So if you enjoy today's presentation, you want to head back over for the first Friday in November, we'll be hearing from Dr. Nikki Nienhuis, and she'll be talking about her experiences working with Jama Birth Village up in the Ferguson-Florissant area, helping combat maternal mortality rates and infant mortality rates within the St. Louis African American community. So that's what will be in store next. Now, if you arrived here because you received Carol Beer's reminder email yesterday, kudos to you. If you would like to continue receiving those email reminders, she's going to need to know that you want them. So she's going to put her email address in the chat, and we encourage you to reach out to her and say, yes, please keep me up to date on what's happening with First Friday Forum. Now, if you didn't receive a reminder email and instead you saw it announced at Platform or in the Connection, and you're like, I would also really like a reminder email, again, her address just popped in the chat. Go ahead and grab it and feel free to send her a message, and she will include you in notifications of our programming going forward. Okay, so without further ado, I think it's time for us to hear from Casey Gardonio-Foat. So you may know her as this amazingly experienced board member of the Ethical Society, or as the AEU board secretary, or as someone who has been helping out with SEEK for the past 8 years. But Casey also has her Ph.D. in art history from New York University's Institute of Fine Arts. She is a master quilter, a wonderful mother and spouse, and lovely friend. And I'm so excited to hear her talk today. And the title of her talk is "A Garden is a Mirror of a Mind: What Landscape Design Reveals About Our Relationship with Nature." Please put your virtual hands together for Dr. Casey Gardonio-Foat.
Thank you all so much. I'm so excited to join you guys and talk about something that's kind of a personal passion of mine. Before I put up the slides, I do want to cover a little bit of logistics and maybe do a little bit of expectation wrangling. This will be the first time that I have given a PowerPoint slide presentation via Zoom. So I'm very accustomed to working with slides on a screen behind me where I can point and being able to look at all your lovely faces and kind of see who's following along and stuff. So this is going to be a very different experience for me because when I have my slideshow up as I'm sharing my screen, I'm not going to be able to see you. So I'm also unfortunately not going to be able to see the chat. And so if people have questions or are writing things in chat, or you can't see something that I'm trying to indicate, I'm going to request that Louise and Crystal maybe kind of monitor that and give me a heads up verbally so that I can keep on top of that, because I won't have all of those visual indicators up on my screen. I'm going to switch to sharing my screen now, and you'll have to bear with me for just a second because I need to put it into the slideshow mode after I switch over to my screen from Zoom so that I can see all the controls. So I'm going to do that now. And while I do that, I want to just kind of launch into my introduction about this. So as an art historian, I specialized in European art of the, let's see, sorry, I have a hard time talking and also pressing buttons at the same time. So hold on just a second here. There we go. Do you all see my slides? Awesome. Okay, fantastic. So to go back to what I was saying, as an art historian, I focused on 17th and 18th century art of Europe and a little bit in Renaissance Europe, and then I did my minor in art of pre-Columbian Americas. So during this period, the thing that got me into it was a semester-long class on the gardens of Versailles under Louis XIV with an instructor who was one of the preeminent scholars on that development and that art history. And it just fascinated me. And that's kind of why I got into art history to begin with. Now, my research kind of took me in a different direction away from garden history based on the people that I was studying with, but garden history has remained this kind of passionate interest of mine. And when I travel, gardens are the first thing that I go to see, which is not uncommon, I've learned. Many people go to visit gardens when they go traveling as one of the main things they do, even more than go to visit museums. And at the same time, our relationship to gardens is a little bit different than our relationship to the rest of the fine arts. In fact, it isn't particularly common for people to necessarily think of gardens as an example of the fine arts, the same way that they think of painting and sculpture. But gardens are designed, they are human-made creations. And so just like anything else that's one of the fine arts, they really are imbued with our sense of a worldview and the zeitgeist and what's going on around us when we're creating them, and how culture and society and politics and religion all influence our world, our views of the world. And so gardens are just as valuable as any other type of fine art for helping us reconstruct how people felt about the world they lived in and their place in it. And so in this talk, I want to kind of walk you through some of what I think are some of the really interesting developments in philosophically how humans have viewed gardens throughout different time periods and cultures. Now, this is not encyclopedic, and it is one of my great weaknesses that whenever I launch into a project like this, I want to make it encyclopedic, and that would entirely overwhelm all of you, and we wouldn't be able to fit it into 45 minutes, of course. So I apologize in advance for omitting, which I probably will do, your favorite garden. I am almost certain to do that. It's just not possible to cover all of them and do them justice. And so these are just a few, but they are ones that I think illustrate some of the basic concepts that I'd like to share with you today. Talking about myself as an art historian, I always practice what's called the social history of art. So instead of looking at development and connoisseurship and the ways that a particular artist's style developed and why that was, I looked at what was being expressed in the art on a broader level and how that reflected general ideas that were held in the society that created that art. And that's the approach that I'm going to take here. I also want to mention that probably strangely for a talk about garden history, I'm not going to be talking a lot about plants tonight. So, and that's probably for the best, because I'm sure every single one in this room is a better gardener than I am in practicality. What I'm going to be talking about more is philosophical, conceptual ideas about the way these gardens and their architecture is designed. So I just want to kind of set that expectation a little bit. That doesn't mean I don't think the plants aren't incredibly important or interesting. It's just that that's not what this talk is going to necessarily focus on. So I'm going to start with a couple of I don't know if you would necessarily call them non-Western examples, although these very first two are. We're going back to some of the 11th and 12th century gardens of Japan, which were, both of the gardens I'm going to show you are based around the ancient capital of Kyoto. And the one that I'm showing you here right now, and please forgive me if you're fluent in Japanese for my inevitable mispronunciation here, but this is Hoji Kokudera, which Kokudera means moss temple or temple of the moss. And this is thought to be one of Japan's oldest gardens. The site was originally a Shinto shrine, and this is going to be a common aspect of all of the gardens that we look at, is that many of these gardens have a relationship to the religious and spiritual views of the cultures that created them and the individuals that created them. So Sahoji was started as a Shinto shrine. It was converted into a Buddhist monastery in about the 12th century. And it was reconstructed again in the 14th century under the Buddhist priests. One of the nice things about not standing up in front of you is that I can actually look at my notes and it's not as surreptitious as it usually is. Under the Buddhist priest Muzo Soseki. So the garden itself was thought to be a representation of Buddha's paradise on earth. And that's the common theme that ties these first couple of gardens I'm going to show you together, is this representation of paradise on earth. How does that relate to how humans of that time saw the natural world and what they wanted to get out of it and what their ideals were? And this idea repeatedly comes up of trying to use the natural world to recreate something that was supernatural. And that's kind of one of the key points that I want to address here. I'm showing you a picture of the dry garden, which is also called the dry cascade. It's a Saihoji. And the dry garden here was based on an 11th century garden treatise called the Sakuteki. This is thought to be one of the oldest garden treatises in the world, by the way. So Sakuteki told us about ways to plan our gardens. And one of the first chapters in the book is about the proper way of setting stones. Stones are an incredibly important part of both Japanese and Chinese gardens. And in fact, these kinds of gardens, if you haven't visited them before, might look a little bit unusual because stones and water features and architectural features often take priority over things like flower beds or expanses of lawn or even trees, although trees do tend to be very important. So Sakuteki, the treatise, mentioned how in order to set stones properly, they must be respected. And the reason for this was the belief that stones were where heavenly spirits came to reside on earth. And so that respect was very important in order to encourage those spirits to come reside in the stones and also to ensure that they brought with them good fortune and harmony. And stones were set in ways that had lots of balance to them. So there is a whole chapter in the garden treatise about how one must balance an upright stone against a reclining stone, or a stone that needed support against one that was a supportive looking structure. The dry cascade here has never had water in it, but was constructed in order to allow the viewer to imagine the cascade of water. And when this site functioned as a Buddhist monastery, the cascade, which split into various rivulets in the imagination, was symbolic of the spread of Buddhism throughout the known world at that time. So I'm going to show you a couple more pictures here. I mentioned that this particular garden is commonly known as the Kokudera, or the Temple of the Moss. And this was really fascinating to me. I don't have a background in Asian art, but it was interesting for me to learn that these pictures of this famous moss garden, that's not how it was actually originally intended to be viewed. That the moss actually grew up over what had originally been white gravel groundwork. And that was a result of both flooding and also an inability to care for the site and constrain the growth of the moss. And I think it's a really lovely thing that now that is one of the things that this garden is most adored for and most well known for, and one of the things that people take pictures of, and which really gives it this kind of meditative kind of aspect. The two pictures I'm showing you here illustrate another aspect of Japanese gardens that was very important, and that's water features, most of which had islands in the middle of them, and then bridges that connect those plots of land over those water features. So I want to go on to another garden that's in Kyoto, almost as old as Saihoji, and this is Ryoanji. This was also a Buddhist temple. It was converted to a temple from having been a wealthy administrator's home at first. And it was converted into a temple in 1450 and then renovated in 1477. The most famous element of Ryoanji, which I'm showing you here, is its dry garden. And so this shows you a continuation of that tradition of dry gardens. Ryoanji's dry garden measures about 33 feet by 98 feet, and it has no plants in it at all, except for the moss that surrounds these outcroppings of rocks. And again, you can see the balance just shown in the outcroppings of rock that you see here, that are grouped into three or grouped into two in pleasing and harmonious combinations that were thought to evoke balance and harmony. And those islands of rock are then surrounded by this raked white gravel. The raked white gravel, you're probably familiar with it. They have features like this at the Botanical Gardens here. They're very common features of Japanese style dry gardens, and they need to be raked daily. And one of the aspects of raking these gardens daily is the meditative, repetitive motions that are physically undertaken in order to rake the gravel, which is actually part of the use of the garden. It's kind of similar to how a medieval garden might have included a labyrinth that would have been walked daily as a form of meditation. Now, one of the really interesting things about the dry garden at Ryoanji is that nobody really understands what it was meant, if it was meant to symbolize something, and what that thing was, if it had indeed been symbolic. And I think that some of the theories about what these rocks might represent are very interesting. A couple of them are, some people have suggested that the rocks represent a mother tiger leading her cubs across a body of water. Some have suggested that they represent islands floating in an archipelago in the ocean, similar to the Japanese archipelago itself. And some have even suggested that they refer to constellations. And when it comes to trying to interpret this garden, I think that the garden historian and landscape designer Elizabeth Barlow Rogers has a really interesting point when she points out that the inexplicability, the fact that we are not able to have a solid, concrete idea of how to interpret this garden in any single way is part of what makes it so beautiful, and is part of what ties it to the tradition of Zen Buddhism and meditation and meditating on koans and other inexplicable types of ideas, and that ties it to that spirituality of the monastery that it would have been a part of. I'm showing you here a landscape that is attributed to the Japanese painter Swami. And this is an ink wash painting. And it's commonly, sometimes this dry garden is actually attributed, its design is attributed to the same painter. And that's based on the resemblance of the outcroppings of rock within this bed of gravel that appears like a water feature almost, to the types of paintings that he did that showed mountains or islands rising out of the ocean. But the other thing that I wanted to point out with this comparison is that you notice that there are kanji characters written on the painting that you see in front of you, and this would have been a poem. Landscape painting in Japan and China of this time always had an inclusion of some kind of literary work or some kind of poem that was thought to harmonize with the view that was being shown. And Japanese landscape designers brought this into their gardens in a concrete way by actually inscribing similar types of poems and characters into the rocks that adorned their gardens and into the architectural features that were there. So that's another kind of link between how they would have perceived the garden and the space around them and the kind of contemplation that they were hoping for the garden to provide a space for them to engage in. So real brief, quick transition to Iberia in southern Spain. Some of you may be familiar with the picture of what I'm showing you here. This is the complex of the Alhambra, this picture taken at dawn. The Alhambra stands in Granada, and it was a center point of the Muslim Caliphate that occupied Spain in the 15th century. until the the late 1400s, when the Moors were driven from Spain by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella during the Reconquest. The Alhambra was a complex that included residences, stables, administrative buildings, but also gardens. And one of the great the very lucky things about history is that after the Reconquest, although many Moorish buildings were repurposed or even torn down by the Catholic Spaniards, the Alhambra was allowed to remain in very much like its original state because Queen Isabella actually requested that she be buried there. So the Alhambra has some of the most famous examples of Islamic style gardens. And so that's what I'd like to show you right now. And what's interesting to me about these gardens is that much of the kind of stereotypical gardens that we see in the medieval period in Europe, even in Christian areas, is based on ideas that were first seen in Muslim gardens and gardens that were designed for Islamic buildings. I'm showing you the patio of the lions at the Alhambra right now. And at first glance, you might look at this and think that doesn't look much like a garden. There's not very many plants in there. And so that is one of the things that I think is really interesting about looking at garden history, is that even though gardens always connect us and help us reflect on our relationship to the natural world, that natural world isn't necessarily conceived the way that we conceive of it in this era in terms of primarily and predominantly being made up of plants. In Muslim gardens, plants were important, but water was also extremely important. And there was a practical reason for this, because in the climate where most of these gardens were constructed, especially in summer, the heat could be incredibly oppressive. And so water was brought into gardens in part because it had a cooling effect, both in raising the humidity level of the air in the gardens itself, but also through stimulating the imagination of cooler areas through the sounds of water. And the sound of water in a Moorish garden is almost as important as the sight of water. Now, water also had a very important relationship to Muslim prayer practices and traditions in terms of the ritual ablutions and cleansing that needed to happen before the daily prayers. And so this was another reason that water was brought into these gardens. Another thing that you notice about this enclosed garden here is, one, it is enclosed. It keeps out the outside world. And second, the play of light and shadow. The opening here just beyond this arcade that you see is open to the sky. And so the interior of this courtyard would be very brightly lit when the sun was at its peak. But the shady courtyard made up of plaster and tile work would again have trapped humidity and created shadows that would have provided a respite from that kind of heat. At the center of the patio of lions is the central water feature. And you can see that this shallow pool here that the lion's spouts water flows into runs off is directed into 4 channels. And I have a little thumbnail of your pictures here, so I can't see the entirety of my picture, but hopefully you can see my cursor as I'm indicating 2 of those channels there. They come off of that central feature at right angles, and then they run through the floors throughout the rest of the complex. These shallow channels are called rills. They're a very important feature of most Moorish gardens. It was a way of incorporating water into a space without actually having to use too much water. And so it was a way of conserving water, but still having the sight and sound of it be present. Now, the way that this is arranged with the central fountain and the square courtyard, and then the 4 rills that each go off to one side of the courtyard, was actually based on the book of Genesis and the descriptions of the Garden of Eden there. The descriptions of the Garden of Eden that these gardens were based on said that in the Garden of Eden there was a central spring that split into 4 rivers that reached the 4 corners of the earth. And so when these gardens were planned, in addition to the practical and pleasurable element of having water in them, there was a symbolic element of actually trying to recreate a sense of the Garden of Earthly Paradise. And it's been suggested that one of the reasons for this is that concept that in Eden, that was the period when God and humankind were actually able to directly communicate, and that outside of Eden, that direct communication link was broken. And so both in Moorish gardens, but also in medieval gardens in Christianity, we see these 4-walled enclosed gardens with a quadrant-based plan and layout, and these 4 dividing features, either the rills as in Moorish gardens or in medieval gardens in the form of walkways that symbolize those four rivers. The idea being that if you could create the idea of Eden on earth, the prayers of the people using that garden might be more easily heard by God because of that trying to recreate a more direct connection. I just want to show you a couple of other of the water features at the Alhambra because they really are one of the reasons that this garden is so famous. One of the other innovations that the builders of the Alhambra used was the reflecting pool. And so this was something that where the designer was really trying to focus the attention of the viewer on the reflections that the water could provide. And in this case, in the courtyard of the Myrtles, the reflecting pool goes all the way up to the edge of the base of the pillars here. And the effect of this is to actually show the reflection of the building as if it's floating on the water in almost a miraculous way. Very quickly, before we turn away from Moorish gardens, I want to show you two patios de naranjos, or patios where orange trees are planted. On the right is the one outside the mosque in Cordoba, and on the left is the one that's outside of the mosque in Seville, which has now been converted into a cathedral. And again, especially in this aerial view, you can see that rectilinear plan that's divided. Here is the central water basin, and then the rills that go out to the four sides of the garden, both providing irrigation for the trees, but also, again, that symbolic link and that symbolic recreation of an earthly paradise. So I'm not showing any pictures of medieval gardens right now, but they really took a lot of these same ideas. So that idea of dividing a garden into four parts, but also having a wall around it. And it's been pointed out that one of the reasons for this walled garden was literally a sense of security. And I only bring that up right now because it's going to become interesting as we look into some of the later gardens when the walls go away. So just keep that in mind. So moving on from this idea of gardens and nature as a recreation of something that was supernatural or spiritual, we move to the age of discovery and the age where Europeans were traveling all over the globe and doing studies in natural history. And so the next type of garden I want to talk about is the Botanical Garden, which is a garden for studying nature and looking at nature as a source of resources, but also of a source of intrigue. And the garden to look at for this is called the Hortus Botanicus. It's at the University of Leiden, and it's one of the oldest botanical gardens in Europe. So during the 17th and 18th centuries, as explorers were going to the Americas, they were going to Asia, in some cases even getting to Australia, the idea of studying plants and bringing back plants from different places of parts of the world became very, very important. And people were looking to use those plants for their medicinal resources and for their culinary uses and also for ornament. And gardens like this botanical garden sprung up both as a way of studying those plants and keeping them safe, but also as a manner of conspicuous consumption. And I think that we have to remember when we look at botanical gardens that they were very much in line with a tradition of collecting. This was the same period when aristocrats would have what they called cabinets of curiosities, where they would have a chamber that they kept all kinds of things that they didn't necessarily consider to be fine art, but they thought were worth studying and knowing about because they told us something about the broader world. And I always have to look at botanical gardens as kind of being the living version of a cabinet of curiosity. So I'm showing you a 17th century engraving of what the initial botanical garden at Leiden looked like. And it was planned out under Carolus Clusius, who was a 16th century botanist. And that garden that he created still stands today. So this is a modern day photograph of it. And you can see that the walkways are laid out with gravel, and then there's very tightly bounded beds here. They each have specimens of plants in them so that they can be kept separated and that they can be studied, but also so that they don't get lost kind of in the shuffle of great big garden beds and ornamental for ornamental purpose. Now, the reason I picked this garden is because this is where tulips were first introduced to Holland. I didn't know this before I went to graduate school, but tulips, even though they're known as the national flower of the Netherlands, are actually native to Turkey, and they weren't even brought to Europe until the 1500s. And when they were brought to Europe, Clusius brought the bulbs to his garden, his botanical garden at the University of Leiden, and this is where the first tulips in the Netherlands bloomed. This is also what led to the enormous inflation of the Dutch tulip market in the 1600s, which, as some of you know, was inflated so far that it eventually crashed and caused some major economic consternation in that country and throughout Europe. This is actually the garden that people would visit from all over Europe to try to acquire rare bulbs and rare specimens of tulips. And I'm showing you an illustration of some of these tulips here. This is one of the very most prized types of tulip. This is actually 4 different species, but you see that all of them have this broken pattern on their petals where they're striped and speckled with different colors. And this was thought to actually be the result of genetic variation at the time. On the right here, I'm showing you, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to go forward. Let's see if I can get back. An engraving that was about contemporary of what a wealthy person who lived in the city, what they would have done with these tulips. They would have had a little walled garden next to their house, and it would have been planted similarly to the kinds of bed layout that you saw in the Botanical Garden. And this is where they would have kept those species of tulips that they had collected as part of their living cabinet of curiosities. Now, unfortunately, in the 1920s, it was discovered by a female botanist and mycologist that the streaking of the petals was not actually due to genetic variation, but was actually due to viral infection. And so many of these types of tulips, although we do have some striped parrot tulips these days, but most of these ones that were so highly prized by the Dutch and led to the inflation of the market are no longer even circulated because they are considered to be a risk to the other tulips that might be grown around them because of the infections that they carry. So pardon me for just a second. I also don't have a clock on my screen, so I want to make sure that I'm keeping track of the time, and it looks like I'm going to have to really speed up here, so I apologize for that. So let's look at my favorite garden of all time. This is Versailles, of course. I'm showing you a 17th century painting of the court of Versailles surrounding Louis XIV at the end of his Grand Canal at his palace at Versailles. And of course, this is the Apollo fountain that shows the god Apollo, whose chariot draws the sun across the sky every morning, rising in the east with his chariot pulled by his horses here. Versailles was designed by the landscape architect André Le Nôtre, who was born in 1613, and Louis XIV actually kind of stole Le Nôtre from another French nobleman, and that was Nikola Fouke, who was his finance minister. Now, I'll get to Nikola Fouke in just a second, but I want to point out one of the most important aspects of Versailles and what went on to become a grand tradition of French formal garden design. And that is the fact that nature in this respect was seen as something that was a palette upon which humans could exert control and display their mastery and their power. And that is precisely what Versailles was. Louis XIV actually enlarged the hunting lodge that was originally at the city of Versailles outside of Paris as a method of reining in and limiting the power of the nobility. And part of the reason for this is that when he was a child and he was in his minority, but after the death of his father, there was a major uprising of the nobility in the French parliament called the Fronde. And Louis XIV actually felt very threatened. He actually had a horde of noblemen break into the palace one night and watch him as he pretended to sleep. And you have to remember that Louis was just a child at this point. And break in and hope to overthrow his mother, who was serving as queen regent. And so this really scarred Louis, and he wanted a means of reining in this power so that something like that would never happen to him again. And the method he devised was to remove all of the nobility of France from their actual land holdings and bring them to Versailles, where he installed them and forced them to live at his court. And so he built this enormous palace at which at some points had 10,000 people living at it. And these people lived there in a society where pleasure was a major distraction. There were all kinds of diversions that Louis and the gardens and his artists created to keep these people distracted, but it also allowed him to keep them from focusing on the kinds of politics and actual power that could allow them to become dangerous to him. So I'm showing you here a plan of the gardens of Versailles, and the park itself is over 2,000 acres. The formal gardens in Versailles cover over 230 acres. So if you can imagine that, the kinds of formal gardens that you see on the right here, this is the orangerie that I'm showing you with its parterres that are made in embroidered styled patterns. Just those types of parks cover over 230 acres here. And so Versailles, in addition to keeping the courtiers in a state of perpetual jockeying for position, also impressed upon them and any visitors and diplomats that visited Versailles from abroad the literal financial power of the king to command resources to keep these gardens in check. And this extended even to things like having all of the flower beds replanted with different flowers overnight, so that when the courtiers went to bed one night, the flowers would be different when they awoke in the morning. And so if you can imagine the manpower that was necessary for that, that was actually a little bit of conspicuous consumption on Louis's part. Now, I mentioned Nikola Fouke, and he was the finance minister when Louis XIV was first installed in his majority as king. And Nikola Fouke built this wonderful palace called Vaux-le-Vicomte, and this was one of Lenotre's first commissions. Nikola Fouke invited Louis and the rest of the court to come to this enormous party at Vaux where he showed off his grand new gardens. And Lenotre was very clever. During the Age of Enlightenment, there were lots of advances being made in optics, in mathematics, and all of a sudden it was possible for landscape designers to more precisely carry over and create the things that they had envisioned on the actual landscape. Again, this is part of that philosophy of using the landscape as something that mankind could control and exert influence over. But Lenotre was also interested in tricks of optics and illusions, and that was a way of exerting control over the viewer. And this is something that he carried out at Vaux-le-Vicomte in ways that made the grounds actually seem larger than they were. In this case, I'm showing you an aerial view, but on the right, I'm showing you a view at the end of the gardens, looking back at the palace. And you can see that if you look at the right side view, there's actually a major change in elevation, that when you're standing in the position that this photo on the right was taken from, you're actually elevated quite a bit over ground level. But from that position, the ground looks completely level because of the ways that Lenotre shaped it using terraces. And the effect of that is to actually make the palace look like it's farther away than it is, so that when it appears to you at that size, you think that it's farther away, and so it actually appears larger to you. Now, this made Louis very jealous, and within a few weeks after the party at Fouquet's mansion, Fouque was actually imprisoned for embezzlement, and Louis XIV confiscated most of his orange trees and all of his artists to come and build Versailles for him. But you can see that some of these same concepts are being put into place here. So in Versailles, if you remember back to that plan, there were a series of axes. Those were radiating roads and pathways, and all of those axes converged at the point from which this photo was taken, which just happened to be where the king's bedroom was. So there was an idea here, propagandistically, of all roads leading to the king, and Louis as the center of all power. Looking outward from that perspective, Louis introduced things such as the Grand Canal, which is a mile-long canal here that used to even have Italian gondoliers plying their boats on it so that you could get around the gardens more quickly. But the real purpose of the Grand Canal was so that when you stood at the head of the gardens themselves would seem to reach to infinity as a symbol of Louis's power and absolute control over the entirety of France, but also his control over the natural world upon which he had imposed these gardens and this extreme geometrical rigor. So I look like I'm coming up on about 1:45, I did want to show you a contemporary garden. The French garden style that Lenôtre brought into Versailles was emulated all over Europe. So from St. Petersburg to Spain. And here we're looking at a garden in the Netherlands at the Palace of Het Loo, which was the palace of the Stadtholder General William of Orange and his consort Mary. And William, after the Glorious Revolution, also was installed as the King of England. And the reason I wanted to show you this very quickly was the comparison between the enormity of Versailles and the sheer size of the gardens and the power that was meant to convey, compared to a much more intimate scale that's seen at Het Loo, which was actually related intentionally to the very different political philosophy of the Netherlands at this time, where instead of having a king who ruled by divine right, you had a stadtholder general who was practically an elected position, and where there was this assumption of shared power between the stadtholder and the rest of the nobility. So the last real type of garden I really want to show you tonight, and to highlight as a difference in terms of a shift of philosophy as to how we view nature, is the English garden park. And the example I'm going to use for this is the Palace of Blenheim in Oxfordshire. Now, I'm sorry, is somebody trying to get my attention? I hear somebody on the line. Okay, no problem. So Blenheim was started in, excuse me for just a second. Blenheim was started in the early 1700s, and this was a period after a great period of upheaval in England, where England was finally experiencing peace and prosperity. And with this, we see a shift in the way that people look at gardens, a shift away from the walled enclosures that served as protection from the natural world, and a shift towards an embracing of the natural world and the countryside, and specifically the English countryside, both as a point of pride, a point of individual aspiration, and also a point of nationalistic pride in terms of celebrating England and the position of prominence that England was rising into as it became richer and more powerful. And with this, we see a corresponding change in the way that gardens are designed. So you notice that in this approach to Blenheim, as opposed to the plan of Versailles, which is filled with fountains and grand approaches and fountains and parterres, we have a broad expanse of lawn. And that's intentional. The idea that the lawn should serve as almost like a frame or a mat for the picture of the house, putting the house at pride of place and not distracting from it, was one of these new changes that came with English landscape design. And I just wanted to show you that plan of Versailles because, again, you can see all of these axial roads, the strict geometry, which subdivides everything according to rigid plans. Now I'm going to show you a picture of the plan of Blenheim. This is the garden at Blenheim, and you can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but here's the palace right here. And these are the equally enormous grounds, but you can see that they have a much more natural appearance. Gone are all of those straight lines that divide things into quadrants. And now we have serpentine lines, which introduce more movement and more interest, but also appear much more naturalistic. Instead of flatly terraced land, we have rolling hills. Instead of fountains and canals that are meticulously planned, we have a naturalistic looking lake. And this was all intentional, this idea that instead of shaping nature to our will, we would appreciate nature for what it looked like in general. Now, the surprise here is that none of this was actually natural. This was just as constructed as Versailles was. It was just meant to look natural. And so if you look at the lake that we have here and the river that appears to flow from it, the whole lake is actually an artificial lake. And when Blenheim was started, excuse me, it was built over a wide valley. Here you can see a contemporary painting that shows the palace on the hill. But where you see the lake right here, that was all dry. There was a small river that ran through it. And the first garden designer who worked here had been trained as a set designer for the theater and insisted on putting an enormous Palladian bridge across it that eventually was called ridiculous by the lady of the house who had hired him to design the gardens, upon which he got insulted and left never to return. So upon that landscape designer, whose name was John Van Brugge's departure, another landscape designer was hired, and he is the most famous of landscape designers in England. His name was Lancelot Brown, but he was commonly known as Capability, which was a nickname that he gained because nothing would stand in his way of shaping the landscape to look like how he wanted it. He was very, very optimistic, according to his contemporaries. And when faced with the problem of this enormous bridge, which it was said could fit 30 rooms beneath it, if you can imagine the scale there, Capability Brown, if we can go back to our last plan, took the river that was running through this area, this valley, and he created a dam so that he could make this artificial lake. He raised the level of the water by 15 feet. And so if you can imagine 15 feet of water missing here, how enormous and how tall that bridge actually is. He raised the water level all the way to the springing of the arch so that it looks completely natural. And what this also does is creates an obstacle that the bridge now becomes a necessary piece of work to cross. So in order to cross the water, all of a sudden the bridge becomes something that's very necessary instead of just a folly. Now, what I found really interesting in reading about this is that this is an artificial lake, and it is artificial not just in that it was created through damming up the river, but the water level is actually controlled by a series of channels and pipes. They were able to control it to within 2 feet. That's how the level of control that they had over the features in this park that looks so natural to our eyes, but actually wasn't. I'm going to skip through the things about Central Park, but I did want to show you the plan of Central Park and compare that to the plan that I showed of Blenheim here. Because one of the reflections that I was having as I was thinking about this talk tonight was how when we look at the English landscape park in particular, it doesn't appear to us to be something that is anything other than natural. When we look at a French landscape or a French garden, it looks very contrived and it looks very artificial to our eyes. And we are trained because of the world we live in and the fact that all of us have grown up using public parks like Central Park on this English park model to think that that is a reflection of the actual natural landscape without really realizing the extent to which humans have actually interfered and shaped that to appear the way that we want it to and to be pleasing to our eyes. And so what I think is really fascinating looking at English landscape design is that it continues to be one of the preeminent ways that we design landscapes even today. When I was picking up my son from cross country, I was thinking how the clumps of trees that grew on the hilltops were an innovation of Capability Brown and weren't something that actually necessarily happens in nature, but that we now expect to see. So I was going to talk a little bit about Central Park as being one of reflecting some of the democracy and the social movements that happened in between when Blenheim was built in the late 1700s and when Central Park was built in New York in the 1800s. I think I'm not going to quite have enough time for that, but I would love to answer any questions that you might have about that and chat with you offline and provide you resources where you can read up on it yourselves. So I think that's about it for my time. I'm sorry that I've gone so far over what I had intended, but I'm happy to answer any questions, and I do want to leave you with a chance to say a few things or make any remarks or ask questions if you want to.
All right. I want to say thank you, Casey, for sharing your expertise with us and clearly your passion. And we're going to have the chance for folks to be able to ask questions. But before we get there, we recognize that it's Friday evening, right? That if you have other obligations, don't feel pressured that you have to stay all the way to the end of the question and answer session. We recognize that you might drop off early. And we can do questions and answer in one of two ways. We can have folks raise their hand using the raise hand feature, and we can call, or depending upon how many questions there are, we might be able to just have folks drop in. But it looks like Brian Vandenberg has a question he wants to ask.
Just before we get started with the questions, Crystal, would you mind facilitating by calling on people with their hands raised? So, okay,
Yes, ma'am.
fantastic.
Got it.
Thank you.
So first,
Brian?
Hi, Casey. Thank you very much. Once again, this is terrific. You've given these kind of talks before, and I've always come away greatly enlightened. And once again, you really made me aware of how gardens are connected to culture and religion and the whole politics. So thank you for that. And I am interested in Forest Park, or yeah, that too, but also Central Park. But my question is, why does everybody need to have a lawn, and why are gardens conceptualized? I mean, they're different, but there's a pattern. It's not, you walk around our neighborhood, these are not Japanese gardens. So I'm curious about the ways in which our lawns and our gardens that we kind of take for granted as the way things should be, what that reflects, how that happened, or any kind of cultural, historical value thing that might.
Sure, that's an awesome question. That actually, I'm so glad you asked it, because it gets into some of the things that I had to cut out of the end of this talk when I was getting into garden design in the Americas. So lawns, first of all, we have lawns because of Capability Brown. Like we literally have them because they were developed and because of the social and cultural milieu in which they developed in Europe for beginners. The lawns were something that was meant to highlight the house. And this was at a time when more and more people had upward mobility. And so more and more people were able to have houses, and they wanted to show off their houses because that was how they gained esteem and made a place for themselves in society. Now, when Capability Brown was working, those were still pretty rich people. But when we get to the United States, that idea becomes democratized. And the person who's thought of as the father of American landscape design, his name was Andrew Jackson Downing. And he actually was familiar with the English landscape park. He was developing and training at the same time that, places like Blenheim were being constructed. But he also grew up along the Hudson River at a period where there was a movement called the picturesque, which was, if you're familiar with writers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and these changing ideas about the relationship of man and the nature of man. And the idea of the sublime was this idea of beauty that could be appreciated stemming from or inspired by a feeling of terror or awe. And so when we get to the Hudson River School with these massive young landscape, which was primarily wilderness, but also made of staggering cliffs and deep drop-offs and valleys, you can understand how that idea of a little bit of fear and the awe that creates really resonated with the people who were living in that part of the country. Now, and so this idea of elevating the natural world and focusing on those elements was very much part of that. When it comes to the lawn, parallel to this development, and something that Downing had a really big hand in, was writing what became an incredibly popular landscape design manual that is still in publication today. There are still current editions of this book out there that encouraged people in the United States to also pay attention to their landscapes. And now we have people who are owning houses who are even more upwardly mobile than the people who are living in Europe and the area of landed gentry and such. And so they have an opportunity to have a house and perhaps fewer resources than the landed gentry, but they have their own plot of land. And Downing was the first person to say, hey, you should pay some attention to the aesthetics of the land that surrounds your house as a way of gaining esteem and also making yourself have more pleasure in the life that you're living in your relationship with nature. And one of the first things that he recommends is having a lawn. So that's part of where lawns come from. Then you get to the Victorian era and the Industrial Revolution, and lawnmowers get introduced. And this also coincides with a period where you have great numbers of nouveau riche who are looking for ways to spend their money. And so originally a lawn would have been cut by hand with scythes, and it was a mark of status how many men you had on the team that had to cut your lawn with scythes by hand. The lawnmower comes along, and all of a sudden anybody can cut their lawn all by themselves if they have one of these machines. And all of a sudden that level of status is within reach. And American culture has just, at least the parts of American culture that are so deeply rooted in specifically English ideals and conventions, are still following in that pattern. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. I think that's a really fascinating
Well, now I know who to blame for these. Thank you. That was terrific.
Thanks.
Nora has a question.
Thank you for your talk. It's been wonderful. Nikola Fouke, did we adopt the last name of Bouquet as in our day and time of the bouquet of flowers? Was that sort of?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, the answer is no. Fouke is actually spelled with an F, not a B. So I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it probably in a way that I'm not speaking clearly enough to make that clear. We don't get the word bouquet from Fouke. However, bouquet probably has its roots in the words for forest in French. At Versailles, one of the major features was what were called garden rooms. In French, they're known as bosquets. And bosque is the French word for forest. And so bosquets were like these little enclosed forests that kind of got slotted into each of those little geometrical areas that you saw in the park when we looked at the plan, where the trees were very, very dense, and they'd have these little, very highly constructed paths through them, but it was almost like you were walking through a hallway into a room. It wasn't open like the gardens that we think of when we go to a flower garden. And it wasn't really even as open as when we think of going into a more wooded area. If you think of like the Ramble in Central Park and stuff, it was, more like hedges. So there really were the plants formed walls, and they would have surprises and little water features and stuff that would surprise people, and people would play hide and seek in them and stuff. And I don't know if bouquet has anything to do with that, but they do sound like they might come from a common root. So I'm sorry I don't have a more factual answer than that.
Yeah, thank you.
Bradley, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed the presentation, and you are a fantastic speaker. Oh my goodness,
Thank you.
this is the first time that I've heard you speak. So,
That's so sweet. Thanks.
So my question is, I have an infestation of bush honeysuckle in my backyard, which was introduced, my understanding, in the 40s, 50s, or 60s, or perhaps the whole time, along with kudzu and all these other awful things that we have to deal with now. My understanding is that was really more for decorative purposes, right? Is there any commentary you have about that fiasco?
That's a great question. So I have to admit that although I am passionate about garden design history, I am a terrible gardener. I am a terrible horticulturist. I'm trying to get better. I practice all the time. I get a lot of practice because most of my plant pets die. But so I'm not super knowledgeable about the importation of invasive species, but it certainly is part and parcel, I think, of this concept of nature as something that is there for people to shape to their liking. And one of the things I would have loved to explore further in this is that, I stopped at Central Park at like the beginning of the 1900s, but that doesn't mean that garden design and philosophy stop there. There is lots of stuff that has been done since then in modern garden design, and certainly in ecologically sound and sustainable garden design. And those are the things that historians will look back at us now and put things like using native plants. They'll put those things into their talks, like the one that I just gave you when they look back at the 2000s. I really wanted to talk about the extension of garden design as moving beyond cultivated gardens and into natural spaces that are left natural on purpose, such as our natural parks, because those kinds of developments also fit right into this method of thinking and the way that humans have changed the ways that they think about our relationship to nature and how we should interact with nature and our place in it. And I think that maybe if I had been able to look more into that, I'd have a better answer for your question about introducing invasive species.
Yeah, it seems like most of these invasive species were imports from Asia. So I thought maybe you might have had some, like someone tried to start a Japanese garden and they decided, kudzu's pretty, let's do that. And then,
well, but if you think about it, if you go all the way back to when tulips were introduced into Europe, or some of the flowers that are thought of as prototypical English garden flowers like peonies and dahlias and what was the other one I was trying to think of? Things like plum trees and apple trees. All of those were imported from Asia too. We don't think about them as being invasive species, but many of the plants that we use in gardens for ornamental purposes and also for agricultural purposes actually do go back to Asia or the Middle East or the Mediterranean. And so when we're thinking about native species, it's interesting to remember that too, because we really kind of have to broaden our idea of what is native and what isn't. A lot of the things that we think of as germane to European garden design aren't from Europe and aren't native at all.
Oh, well, thank you.
Thank you.
And then there are a couple of comments in the chat, folks hypothesizing that, and I've heard this too, that possibly kudzu was introduced and planted to control soil erosion, and also that kudzu might be cheap cattle feed.
They do eat it in Japan. So.
That's really interesting. It would be really interesting to look into that. You could write a whole paper just on that. So it certainly wouldn't be the first time that people have moved plants around the globe for purposes that served them, but not necessarily the natural environment.
Carol, do you have a question?
I do. I'm not exactly sure what the question is, but would you make some comments about Forest Park?
Sure. Yeah, I had really wanted to get to Forest Park. I'm kind of sad that I was so scared, as I am every time, that I would get into the beginning of this talk and not have enough to fill up all the time, as I think I mentioned to you at the very beginning. And of course, I ran over. Forest Park is very much designed on the same ideals as Central Park, and so it's part and parcel. You may or may not be aware that the Central Park in New York City was initially proposed by Andrew Jackson Downing as a public park, but he died, unfortunately, before he was able to take over the design. So his business partner, Calvert Vaux, partnered with a young up-and-coming garden designer named Frederick Law Olmsted. They entered a contest to create the plan for Central Park, and were the winning entry. And Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux went on to design parks all over the United States. And so most of what we think of as public parks is related in some way to the work that they did as pioneers. Frederick Law Olmsted actually had a firm that worked on the grounds of Washington University in St. Louis. And so Forest Park, I don't think was something that he was personally involved in creating, but I tried to look this up, but I just ran out of time before giving this presentation. But I'm pretty sure that one of his disciples is responsible for having created Forest Park. And it would have been created with exactly the same kind of ideals in mind, as a place for people of all social classes to be able to go and enjoy the kind of communion with nature that had previously, in the early 1900s and late 1800s, been the province that was something that was only accessible to people of the upper classes. So does that answer your question a little bit, Carol? Certainly the connection with the World's Fair is really, really important there too. And unfortunately, I, off the top of my head, don't know a whole lot about that, but.
Thank you.
Casey, it doesn't look like we have other questions, but we all have a lot of gratitude for you to offer your experience today. So can we go ahead and give Casey another rousing round of applause?
Thank you.
Thank you. You guys are such a wonderful audience. Thank you so much.